And before we start, we might as well see if body mics are working.
So far. We'll get through here.
Hi there.
Hey, Rob.
Lee's
Good.
mic is working. I assume Dr. Fulner's is. Ed just doesn't want to say anything for me to see if his mic is working.
Testing, testing.
Thank you.
Did it work? Okay.
Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Never hurts. Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For those in-house, your only task at the moment is to see that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off as a courtesy as we begin. And, of course, we will post today's program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. Interviewing our special guest today is the gentleman at Heritage who, of course, needs no introduction, our president, Dr. Edwin J. Fulner. Dr. Fulner.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John. Thanks, John, and thanks, ladies and gentlemen, good friends all. It's kind of redundant, I guess, to introduce somebody whose biography we are here to discuss. But Lee Edwards, number 2, something that will perhaps come up a little bit later in our discussion, has been at the heart of the conservative movement for all of his adult life and therefore the adult life of everybody here, going way back. We will get into specifics about it, but at the moment, one of the things I am most grateful for is the last 20-some years, about 20 years, that Lee has held the title of Distinguished Fellow here at the Heritage Foundation, where he is the historian of the modern conservative movement, and where his keeping of the books has been so important, not just to Heritage, but to every organization, both here represented and around the country, and indeed around the world. Lee's manifest involvement in so many organizations, I hope, will become apparent as we have this discussion. But Lee, let's dig right into it. I've, in the process of reading, and I will have read by the end of Thanksgiving vacation all the way through, just right. Why did you do this?
Well, I had nothing else to do, Ed. Oh. Well, I was not satisfied with what I read in the standard histories and biographies, particularly about 3 great heroes of mine that I talk about in the book, Ronald Reagan, Barry Goldwater, and Bill Buckley. Clark Clifford, who was supposed to be and was one of the wise men of Washington, D.C. for many years, when he heard about Reagan coming to Washington, described him as an amiable dunce. An amiable dunce. And Tip O'Neill, when Reagan arrived, said, "Well, Mr. President, welcome to the major leagues." And I knew that Reagan, from having visited his house and his library, we can get into that story if you like, more detail, was anything but an amiable dunce, that he was somebody who was a very thoughtful man. As a matter of fact, he, Ronald Reagan, was an intellectual. And I tried that out on a couple of intellectuals, and they just poo-pooed the idea, so I knew that we had to really get into the detail of this. Barry Goldwater, a hero to me and to many others, is invariably described as the man who voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as though that somehow summed up Barry Goldwater. And there were good reasons why he did so, but I called him, in a book that I wrote some 20 years ago now, the most consequential loser the most consequential loser in American politics. Consequential because of the impact that he had on American politics. And as Bill Buckley, probably it's a little bit more mixed. People always refer to him, as a Renaissance man and obviously brilliant in conversation and so forth. But what I discovered two things about him. Number one, that he was a very, very serious Catholic, and that was important to understanding Bill Buckley. And he was also one of the most charitable, giving people that I ever met, and was always doing favors for people, including me. As a matter of fact, I say in there that Bill Buckley saved me from myself because he published my first article in National Review. And up at that time, I was actually living in Paris and writing. I wrote a novel, rejected. I wrote several short stories, rejected. Wrote several poems, rejected. And I woke up one day with a really horrific hangover. And I said, why am I here? Why am I doing this? Why am I beating my head against the wall, writing this fiction? It's just not working out. And so I came back home, and I wrote a piece about France, in which I talked about the need for strong leadership, because France was, this is the late 50s, having some real problems with managing itself. And I said, unless somebody like Charles de Gaulle came along, France is going to be in real trouble. So Bill published that article. It was my first article in 1958. 1958.
And NR was just in its third year.
Right, right. I'd never met Bill Buckley. Never met him. And so I just, on an off chance, decided I would give a chance and send it off to him. And he liked it and published it. And that was the beginning of my realizing that the market was trying to tell me something, rejection, rejection, and acceptance. Oh, I think I'll go that direction.
So, okay, you came back deciding you were not Ernest Hemingway Jr.
Right. Tried so hard,
but
particularly on
you were the son of the legendary, to those of us who grew up and knew and loved the old Chicago Tribune, but the legendary Willard Edwards.
Right.
And you're a South Sider too, go White Sox.
Right, Comiskey Park and all the
There
rest.
we are,
Yeah.
But you ended up in Washington early on, because your dad kind of got reassigned. How'd that all, I mean, he was a favorite of Colonel McCormick's,
yes,
wasn't he?
Yes, he was, and he was all during the 1920s covering the roaring 20s in Chicago.
Al Capone and all.
Al Capone. I'll have to digress there because it's a wonderful story. So he met this attractive secretary in the criminal courts building named Leila Sullivan, and he asked her out, and she said, well, Willard, this is my mother-to-be, and she said to him, Willard, I've been asked to sing at this party, because she had a beautiful voice. Do you think I ought to do it? And he said, well, maybe, Leila. Who's the guest of honor? She said, Al Capone. I said, well, I don't think you probably ought to do that, unless it's a very large fee, And she said, okay, I think probably you're right. And she did not. So they got married. And subsequently, he was assigned to the Hauptmann trial of the kidnapping of Lindbergh baby, which is the big story of the decade, at least domestic crime story. And Dad covered that, did so well that they brought him down to Washington, D.C. in 1935. And so the next 40 years, he was covering the White House, the Senate, national conventions, national political campaigns, and so forth, was the go-to guy for all of that. And it's one of the reasons why I did not get into political writing right away, because there was no way, how could I compete with somebody like that? And so I went 3,000 miles away to Paris to try to find myself.
Yeah, yeah. I guess I'm glad that your father didn't meet my grandfather, who was a Chicago police sergeant on the South Side the same time he was covering Al Capone et al. But that's another story we could. Okay, so your dad was a big conservative. Is that why you're a conservative?
No, no, I'm a conservative because of communism. That year and a plus that I was in Paris was 56, 57. I'd just come out of the Army. And came October of 1956. And all of a sudden, we began hearing these bulletins from Budapest. And it was the Hungarian Revolution. And here were young men and women of my age, it's in my early 20s, standing up to the Soviets, standing up to Soviet tanks, the Soviet guns. And I was so excited about this. I just caught up in the bravery and the courage and the desire for freedom of these young Hungarians. And then, of course, 2 weeks later, the Soviet tanks came back, firing, shooting, killing maybe 20,000 young Hungarians, something like that. And then a couple 100,000 more Hungarians fleeing into exile, because the Soviets were not going to let go of that country. And I waited for my country to do something, my country to do something. I waited for, more than just a press release, more than just a UN resolution.
Yeah. John Foster Dulles to actually make a decision that mattered. Yeah.
Right. And it did not. Yeah. And I was embarrassed, I was ashamed, I was angry about this. And I resolved at that point, Ed, that I would do whatever I could for the rest of my life to oppose communism and to help those who were resisting it as well.
But at that time, anti-communism was pretty much across the political spectrum in the United States.
Yes,
I think back in Illinois, Paul Douglas was an anti-communist. He was a big Democrat.
Yes.
And later Scoop Jackson, et cetera. Right. So why are you a conservative?
Well, I was very, very busy getting into politics, starting my own firm, working with politicians, working with organizations and so forth. And then I realized that, well, I really have to know a little bit more about this thing called conservatism. So my father had given me a book called The Conservative Mind. And he said, to Lee, who will understand it, which I won't. But that's not true. He was smart. He could understand it full well. And by giving me that book by Russell Kirk, The Conservative Mind, that began to give me, it was the beginning. It was the beginning of my understanding what conservatism was all about. And then working with people like Barry Goldwater and others, and reading his book too, The Conscience of the Conservative. Yeah. That also had an impact. That was only 125 pages, whereas The Conservative Mind was 500 pages.
Yeah. You and I have talked about the role of ideas on people, and as you know, my three biggest heroes were Kirk, Hayek, and the late G.K. Chesterton. But Hayek plays a very special role. You mentioned Ronald Reagan in his library. Tell us that story. That's fascinating.
Right. Yeah. Well, getting back to this idea that Reagan was just an amiable dunce, which I knew from personal knowledge it was stupid, because in 1965, after he had given his famous A Time for Choosing TV address for Barry Goldwater, I had an opportunity to write on spec a profile of him for the Reader's Digest. So he said, come on out, spend a couple of days with us. So Anne, there she is, in the front row, just where she belongs, in the front row. And you'll hear more about her later and why she deserves that applause. So we were out there, and we spent 2 days with Reagan in a limo And this is interesting. Talk about large, retainers and entourages and so forth. There were four of us. There was the driver, Ann in the front seat, me in the back seat, and Reagan over here in this seat. And between us was a tape recorder. But it was a woolen sock. It was literally this big. It was a piece of luggage. It was reel to reel. So that Mr. Woolen sock was between Reagan and me, and I had this great big microphone asking him questions. And at the end of the second day, and he was just amazing. He already had the aura, of course, of a star. Here was obviously somebody that could be an important political figure. So he said, well, come on up to the house, have some iced tea and cookies, and we'll relax a little bit. So we went up to the Pacific Palisades, up the hills, to this rather modest home, lots of GE stuff
Company
there.
discount.
Right, lots of that. And while he and Nancy were in the kitchen, they put us in the library in the den, and there were the books, the shelves and shelves and shelves of books. I'm thinking, oh, I thought, wait a minute, I thought this was supposed to be a B movie, quote, star, somebody who just read what other people gave him. So I went over, began looking at the titles. And I'm not making this up, guys. I mean, politics, economics, history, book after book after book. I got a little closer. And all of a sudden I realized there were classics, conservative classics, including The Road to Serfdom by Hayek, including Witness by Whittaker Chambers, including Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, and including a book I had not read, The Law by Frederick Bastiat. I said, well, who the heck is Bastiat? I did not know who he was. I learned subsequently, a 19th century economist, free enterprise, pushing for capitalism in France in the 19th century. And I thought to myself, well, this is not some amiable dunce. This is a thinking, reasoning guy who had arrived at his philosophy. This is 1965. Who had arrived at his philosophy the old-fashioned way, reading one book at a time.
Did you talk to then former Governor Reagan about that and about the role of these books? And I mean, what did he do? He took them with him when he was on a Pullman from one stop to the other with General Electric because he didn't like to fly. We know that.
Well, you'd have to go back. I mean, he was always a reader. Even when he was from the age of 5 or 6 or 7, when he first began reading, he was always a reader. I should say, periodicals, Reader's Digest he liked, subsequently National Review, newspapers. And from 1954 to 1962, when he was the host of GE Theater, which was on Sunday nights, #1 rated show at the time. And part of his arrangement with General Electric was to visit all 125 GE plants, 125 plants across the country. That was part of his deal. So he would take off for about 10 weeks with an escort, just one guy, and they would go from city to city. But because he was afraid of flying at that time, took the train. So he was taking a train from New York to Dallas, from LA to Chicago and so forth. What are you going to do on these long train rides but read? And he would begin reading these magazines, making notes of them for the speeches, because he was not only talking to the employees of the GE plants, but he'd visit and talk to the Kiwanis, young Republican clubs, young women's clubs and so forth. And he began developing what became the speech by reading. Yeah. So certainly he understood from an early time the power of ideas.
Yeah, and of course, thanks to what's been going on at the Ronald Reagan Library and what the late Martin Anderson and his wife and Karen Skinner did, they've they found some of these cards, note cards, and their volume, Reagan in his own hand, certainly amplifies your own experience and your early. When did you do your biography then? When did it actually appear?
It appeared in 1967, and it was the first biography of Ronald Reagan. And I predicted, he was then governor for 1 year.
Yeah, yeah.
And I predicted in that he would be president one day. Now, I have not always been right. Not always, even though just right, not always right. I say just right, not always right. But I was right about that. I was right about it because you could tell that he had it. But what was remarkable, you're talking about those scripts that Kieran and Marty and Annalise discovered. So he leaves the governorship. 76, he tries to get the nomination from Jerry Ford. He does not succeed in that. He goes on radio and does 3 to 4 minute commentary, which he wrote those commentaries himself. They were based upon current events, but also upon certain historical events as well. And NSC 68, and Elizabeth would understand this, and how this was, what, a 40-page, 50-page, 70-page, something like that. 70-page, NSC 68, one of the great documents of the Cold War, published in 1950, as I recall. It was not really published in its entirety for the public till the mid-70s. Reagan does 2 broadcasts about it. Here's a 70-page document, a very sophisticated thing about the Cold War. What should be the military arrangements? How aggressive or defensive should we be? What should be our role against the Soviet Union? Some very deep and profound stuff. He summarized it in 2 4-minute broadcasts. Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of reporters in this town who would like to be able to have that kind of ability and that kind of talent. Yeah. And Ronald Reagan had developed that over the years, going back to when he was a sportscaster with WHO in Des Moines, Iowa.
Yeah.
So, as a matter of fact, I think it was George Shultz said that Reagan was a one-man think tank. And that was true. And so he wrote all of these out in longhand, blue pen on these legal pads, came back to the office, gave it to the assistant there to type so he could use it for the broadcasts, which were taped in advance. And as far as he was concerned, that was the end of it. But she had the good sense to take those handwritten transcripts, manuscripts rather, and put them in a drawer of a desk, which is where they rested for a couple of decades before Kieran discovered
them. Yeah, yeah.
So much for being an amiable dunce.
Yeah, yeah. So, looking back, he's one of your heroes?
Oh, yes.
Who else?
Yeah. Well, Barry Goldwater is a hero of mine, certainly. As I say, the most consequential loser in American politics. God bless Barry Goldwater. I mean, if you could give him an issue, Social Security, and he'd say, weak, weak, we got to do something about it. We have to have some kind of a voluntary option for it. This was back in the 60s, okay, when he ran for president. This was so extreme. I mean, this is talk about third rail issues. This was danger to be able to talk that way about Social Security or taxes. The graduated tax, the confiscatory tax, we should just have a flat tax. A flat tax? Talk about that. With Lyndon Baines Johnson spending trillions of dollars. It's crazy. He would go and say out to South Dakota that we got to do away with farm subsidies. There are 100,000 farmers. He made this speech literally to 100,000 farmers. Got up there, and 2 senators have been working with Barry leading up to it. We think we got him to say just enough and not too much. He gets up there. He says, well, I want to say one thing to you all, 100,000 farmers out there. Got to do away with them subsidies, right? Hello? Anybody out there? It wasn't. Even the senators sitting behind him weren't applauding on that one.
Yeah.
He was amazing. TVA, did we really need TVA? He went to Tennessee and said, let's sell off part of TVA. He would go to people, give speeches, he'd say, I don't want your vote, only if you agree with my positions on the issues. But I don't want your vote just because I'm a Republican. I want your vote because you believe in what I have to say.
Okay. Reagan, Goldwater, who rounds out your trinity?
Then it would be Bill Buckley.
Buckley.
Bill Buckley. Not only because he saved me from myself, but because he was so important in laying an intellectual foundation and popularizing the ideas of a Hayek and a Kirk and a Chambers and so forth. And both Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan read carefully every week, every other week, National Review. It had an impact, no question about that. Yeah. No question.
Well, and of course, Russell Kirk was a regular contributor.
Yes.
When he was at C.W. Post College in Long Island. Remember
right.
those days?
Right. Yeah. But I think Bill Buckley, what was so amazing about him, again, this idea of Renaissance man, yes. But you think about it, he was wealthy. He was wealthy. And his wife, Pat, was even wealthier.
Really wealthy.
Really wealthy. One of the leading families of Canada. So he could have been a playboy. Could have been the playboy of the Western world, as I put it, and just right. And yet he chose to be the St. Paul of the conservative movement, to be an evangelist, to be someone who was out there selling conservatism for almost 60 years.
Yeah.
Again and again and again.
Well, yeah, mentioning Buckley, of course, reminds me anyway, of Sharon, Connecticut. And something happened at Sharon early on. You were there. You relate that to us in the book. Talk to us just a little bit about what it was like, because younger generation conservatives have no idea what it was like 50, 60 years ago in the conservative movement. As Stan Evans said, we could meet in a phone booth.
Right, indeed, indeed. The idea that young men and women would describe themselves as conservatives was just a crazy idea. I mean, there was only one tradition, according to Lionel Trilling, the leading intellectual of the day. There's only one tradition in America, that's the liberal tradition. And conservatives occasionally will have ideas, he said, but usually express themselves in irritable mental gestures.
Yeah.
That's how contemptuous liberal intellectuals were of conservatives. So the idea that young men and women like me and Annette Kirk, later married Russell, she was coeur de manche at the time, would openly, publicly declare ourselves to be conservative was just, crazy idea. But Buckley saw that there was a need for a political organization among the youth that was conservative. And so he encouraged the idea, and then we took the ball and ran with it. This was all in September of 1960, before Nixon lost the presidency to John Kennedy. So there we were, filled with this idea of we're going to promote conservatism. How can we do that? Well, let's have a rally in New York City. Let's have it, the first one, which was in March of 1961, was at Manhattan Center, which I think Ann had, 33,000 or so, 4,000 capacity, something like that. 4,000 people showed up, and we turned away 2,000 or 3,000 people. Now, we'd been in business, Morton, this is crazy, right? We'd been in business 6 months, and we're having a rally at Manhattan Center. We have 4,000 or 5,000 people come. Now, there was a little secret attached to this. Our little sort of hole in the card in the hole was that our main speaker was Barry Goldwater. And Barry Goldwater had not spoken in New York City in some time, so he was the draw. He was how we were able to get that many conservatives. We were so carried away, we said, well, let's do something like this next year. So we said, well, I was on the board, and we said, well, should we have it? Where should we have it? Madison Square Garden. Capacity, 18,000. 18,000. Okay, let's go for it. Let's go for it. Again, we were able to persuade Barry Goldwater to come and speak. 18,000 people showed up, and we turned away, maybe, conservatively, 5,000 and maybe 10,000 people. The fire marshals wouldn't let them in. It was on that occasion that Barry Goldwater certainly became a national figure, because here he was in the center, the very center of liberalism, New York City, 1962, and talking about conservatism being the wave of the future. And of course, we believe that. We believe that as young conservatives. And we set about helping him in his campaign, and then later on, of course, working in Ronald Reagan's several campaigns as well.
Yeah. You know, your characterization of Bill Buckley, of course, carries on throughout his career. Just 3 years later, I had the great fortune of meeting him and being present when he first met Milton Friedman, and we came up with the concept of the Philadelphia Society among 5 of us, Frank Meyer and Don Lipset and myself. And I was elected treasurer, and I said, hey guys, I'm in graduate school. I can't afford to open a checking account with something called the Philadelphia Society. Bill Buckley wrote out a check for $100 to start the Philadelphia Society. And I mean, that's the kind of guy that he really was.
He stepped up again and again and again. And I think also that he was something of a politician, because you think about it, he was involved with Young Americans for Freedom, with the Conservative Party of New York, with his then running, of course, for mayor of New York City in 1965. And that was when Bill Buckley really took off as a national figure. So there we were. The 1960s was an extraordinary decade, but it really was a decade of the left, not just of the left, but also of the right. Of the right, you think Barry Goldwater running for president, Bill Buckley running for mayor, Ronald Reagan running for governor of California, the most populous state, and winning, and winning. So really, the 60s were the rise of the right in so many ways.
Yeah.
That's my next book.
Okay, the next book, okay. Why does Richard Viguerie call you 002? As in, I know what James Bond was 007, but you're 002. You outrank James Bond.
Yes, right. I love Richard. Is he here? I'm not sure. He's probably busy working. He's almost as old as I am, and he works even harder than I do. Well, it's because one of our heroes is Phyllis Schlafly, and Phyllis Schlafly was on the national stage for longer than any other conservative. And Richard got out his calculator and figured that I was the second to Phyllis. So she was 001 and I was 002. But I'm refusing to be made 001 and see what happens to 001. Not gonna.
Yeah. You've written 25 books?
About that, yeah.
What was the hardest one to write?
The hardest one to write was this one, Just Right. Because it was easy, it's easy for me to write about other people, whether it's Goldwater and Reagan and you, Ed Meese, all the others that I've written about. But it's hard to write about yourself. What's the right balance? You know, talking about yourself and bragging about yourself, taking credit for yourself, and all the rest of that. And so I'm not interested in that kind of a book, which is why Just Right is so heavily committed to talking about the victims of communism.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. 100 years since the Bolshevik Revolution. You just commemorated that. I'd say celebrated, certainly. Commemorated that at the Victims of Communism with a 3-day conference, remembering the 100 million, more than 100 million victims of communism in so many countries around the world. Why has that been such a passion of your whole life?
Well, I'd mentioned, Ed, already the Hungarian Revolution, but even before that, through my father, who became quite an expert on communism, and as a matter of fact, was there the day that Alger Hiss and Whittaker Chambers confronted each other at a congressional hearing. Yeah. And my father was, well, he was a pretty savvy guy, pretty cynical guy when it was necessary, was actually more impressed by Hiss than he was by Chambers, just on first blush. And he was warned off that attitude by Richard Nixon, because that was the House Committee on American Activities. Nixon was a member of it, and there was something about Hiss, said Nixon to my father, that doesn't quite, he's a little too smooth, and his answers are a little too calculated. There's something there that's not quite what he says it is. Yeah. So through my father, I met many, many anti-communists. I also met ex-communists as well, who were now anti-communists. And so I was made aware at a very early age of the innate desire for freedom that's in all of us, and the fact that communism wants to kill that desire, smother that desire, prevent that desire from being expressed.
Wow. You and I have discussed in the past both Witness in its entirety, but also that incredible first chapter, Letter to My Children, which, as you know, I had special affection for as my very first president's essay 25 or 6 years ago. I mean, I still can't read it or even look at a couple paragraphs of it without tears coming to my eyes.
Right, right. There's a wonderful story about that, Ed, and I'm sure you know it, and I think I tell it. Tony Dolan, who was a major speechwriter for Ronald Reagan, and a Pulitzer Prize winner in his own right.
And now back in the White House writing speeches, too, for this president.
Oh, yeah? I didn't know. That's terrific. I'll have to call up Tony and ask him to explain Trump to me. Anyway.
That's my next question for you.
So Tony, in his first week with his new boss, Ronald Reagan, they're talking about all kinds of things. And Tony says, well, Mr. President, have you read Witness by Whittaker Chambers? And the president said, well, and he begins reciting from the first chapter, A Letter to My Children. And he does a couple of lines, and a couple of more lines, and then several more lines. We're now into maybe page 2 of this, and Tony says, okay, Mr. President, I get it. It's important. He said, yes, so important in my understanding of communism. And Whittaker Chambers is a great hero of mine, said Reagan to Tony Dolan. So that goes back to something that you and I believe in so passionately, and that is the power of ideas and the power of one book. That the fact that Reagan was so impressed by that, the fact that both Reagan and Goldwater had read The Road to Serfdom, and on. That's why what we do here at Heritage is so important.
We're in a strange political and, kind of an unknown political environment right now. Are conservatives winning or losing? What's happening is, we see the president do some great things, in my estimation, in terms of rolling back the administrative state, in terms of what he's trying to do on tax policy, in terms of standing up for America. Then some...
Judiciary.
Yeah, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
yeah. Neil Gorsuch and the lower federal bench. But what do you think? Are conservatives back?
Well, I think certainly when you compare it with Mr. Obama, yes, we're certainly back. And certainly when you consider what the alternative would have been of, Hillary Clinton.
My old intern, yeah.
Right, that's right. And you like to say, I know, that you gave Hillary her first Washington job.
Yeah.
So, as you might suspect, I'm out doing a little promoting of this book in various places, and I get a Trump question all the time. And so I've had to develop an answer because I don't want to be trumped.
Oh.
Okay. Well,
yeah.
So what I've suggested is something like this. It demands, first of all, he's not a conservative, no, but he does do conservative things for which he should be given credit. So I think it should be two tracks. One track is you look at what he is doing and has done, the things you mentioned, whether it's Gorsuch and others, trying to eliminate some of those regulations that Mr. Obama put in without anybody's say-so, and other standing up for America, building up the military, talking about our veterans, standing up to the radical Islamists, and he's been very, very good about that. So these are all the good things. Then over here we have the other track, which is the tweet track. The tweet track. Not easy to say that, by the way. Tweet track. And that's something you don't pay that much attention to. I mean, I don't. I just, every now and again I have to, because we get inundated with repetition by the media and so forth, and his own repetition for that matter. But not to pay attention to what he's tweeting all the time, which I don't think is substantive. And I think why does he do it? Well, I think he does it for a couple of reasons. Number one, that he's playing with the media, and he's sort of toying with them by dropping all of these tweets all the time and distracting them from more substantive analysis. But I think also he's doing the tweeting because he wants to stay in touch with the people who voted for him. What, 61 million people who voted for him, something like that. And so he's always conscious of that base and letting them know, hey, I'm paying attention to you. I'm trying to keep my promises from the election. And so, yes, look at my accomplishments, but he's almost like he's winking at them when he does these tweets.
Well, if Ronald Reagan could do it in 4 minutes, I guess Donald Trump in this new technological age figures he can do it in 250 characters.
Well, I think Reagan would be tweeting all the time. I really do. I really do. I think he would be very comfortable.
Thought.
He was such a wonderful communicator.
Yeah. So you talked about the conservative mind. You talked about witness. If you only pick, what is the most important book?
Well, I think for conservatives, I would say it's the two you've just mentioned. I don't think you can say one or the other, because conservatism is not all libertarian, nor is it all traditional. To me, a true conservative is a fusionist, somebody who blends and can call upon both the libertarian tradition and the conservative tradition, leaning towards the conservative tradition. I take my lead from Barry Goldwater, who in The Conscience of a Conservative said that man has an economic side and a spiritual side, and the spiritual side is the more important side. So I give Kirk a place of higher honor than I do to Hayek. But you must, I think, be familiar with the ideas of both of them and the works of both of them to be the kind of fusionist conservative that we need today.
Fusionism, Frank Meyer, and
Yes.
the
Yeah.
early efforts
Right.
at National Review. Lee, we only have a few minutes left. Why don't we throw it open to
Oh, yeah,
comments or
golly.
questions from
Yeah.
people in the audience?
Sorry.
Please.
My name is Cami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator, and my question is about strange political environment. Is that more strange now than it was during Reagan time when media was after then Attorney General and Meese? I'm asking this question because I was very new in this country and I was obsessed with NPR, and NPR was obsessed with getting him out of the White House after resigning him.
Right.
So do you see any comparison between the media's intensity against Ed Meese, and media has same kind of intensity against the current president? They just want him out, they just want him to get lost.
Well, you have two different kinds of media. Back in the Reagan's days, you had still something of a cartel.
3 networks.
With the 3 networks, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and so forth. And that was it, and the AP, UPI, which took its lead very often from the Times and the Post. Today, of course, you have this incredible explosion through the social media, plus talk radio, which you didn't have then, plus Fox News, which you didn't have then, and all the other cable news programs. So to my mind, the opportunities for getting out ideas are better now than they were then, that the Post and the New York Times cannot bring down a politician as they tried to do, and I think maybe to some extent did with Richard Nixon. We're in a much better shape today with the multiplication that we have of the mass media, of the news media. Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yes, sir.
It seems to me the conventional narrative nowadays is that the so-called Red Scare, the blacklisting in Hollywood, the House of Un-American Activities Committees, this was all just a black blot on America, that this was just a lot of harem-scarum. And what's your take on that sort of prevailing narrative?
Right. Talking about the Red Scare of the 40s and the 50s, Joe McCarthy,
Yes.
and so forth. Fortunately for all of us, and not just for conservatives, but anybody who wants to be open-minded about this, Stan Evans has written a definitive study about Joe McCarthy and the anti-communism of that period. Blacklisted by History is the title of it. And Stan, using FBI files, now he did not using National Review or Human Events, using the FBI, proves that Joe McCarthy was wrong. There actually were more communists in our government than Joe McCarthy said. And he documents that in this book, Blacklisted. And I think for those of you who are interested, want to learn a bit more about it, pick up a copy of it. Yes. Martin.
Hi. How would you compare Trump and conservatism versus Nixon and conservatism?
Want to hear that one, Odell?
Because Trump is more like Nixon than anybody else.
Well, I don't know about that. I think, conservatives always respected Nixon because, quote, he got Alger Hiss. It was always because of that. There's no question that Nixon played the major role in making sure that Hiss was exposed, and he supported Chambers, exposed Hiss, finally went to jail. All of that is to the good. But when he became president, domestically, he was doing things like OSHA, EPA, and so forth. Foreign policy-wise, he was sitting down with Mr. Brezhnev and doing a SALT treaty, or going off to Beijing and kowtowing to Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. So this is not he was not a conservative. Trump, I think, has figured out this about the political scene right now. There is this populist element in America, and I would argue it's been there since Barry Goldwater. It was there with Barry Goldwater talking about the forgotten American, with Reagan talking about the moral majority, Newt Gingrich talking about the contract with America, and finally the Tea Party. A very direct line, Martin, a very direct line of a populism in America and in the conservative movement. And I think that what Mr. Trump has figured out is a way of appealing to them, keeping them happy, and trying to bring about a greater and a stronger America in so doing. So I don't see any real similarity between Nixon and Trump at all.
Interesting. Maybe one more?
Hi, Mariah. I work for the Heritage Foundation. Thanks so much for being here. My question is, you mentioned communism looking backwards and those that have been victims, but communism's still alive. And I feel that people in my generation don't seem to understand that, as well as socialism.
Right.
So how can we make sure that that message isn't lost, that countries still exist with the Communist Party in rule, and that those are things that we still need to address that I fear are coming back into the United States, as you briefly mentioned as well?
Right. Well, thank you so much, and you're absolutely right. There are still 5 communist regimes, China, North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, and what is the 5th one? No, not Venezuela. No, not yet. No. Who said it? No. Laos, it is. Laos is the 5th. Little Laos has been under a communist regime for 40 years. For 40 years. So, and we did a poll, victims of communism. This is my other hat, Ed. My pro bono hat, pro bono hat. With the victims of communism, we did a poll, just YouGov did, which showed that almost 50% of millennials, your generation, are more comfortable with and more accepting of socialism than they are of communism. So there is a lot of educating which has to be done. And I think we can begin to do it by saying to the millennials, well, you say you're comfortable with socialism. Are you comfortable with doing away with individual rights? Are you comfortable with doing away with private property totally? Are you comfortable with being only concerned about what the group says and not what you say? Are you comfortable, frankly, without God? Without God. And that is a basic tenet of Marxism/communism/socialism. These are some of the arguments which we need to make with the millennials and wake them up to the fact that this system that we have in this country, capitalism, free enterprise, has given more opportunity, more prosperity to more people than any other systems ever been existed.
Lee, let me, if I may, modestly correct you. You said socialism versus communism. You meant socialism versus capitalism.
Right.
Socialism,
right.
communism on
Right.
one side,
Right.
capitalism on the other.
Thank you.
Just
Right.
for the record here. One more. Last question.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. I appreciate your time, and I'm congratulating you on a new book. I just want to follow up on the question before. Dr. Alan Keyes, who was a fellow here before, he made a statement in, I believe, in an interview last week where he referred to former President Obama as pushing an agenda to move this country to a communist state. I don't know if you all was able to catch that, but he did. And I want to know, not so much do you agree with him, but could you explain what he's trying to say? Because I didn't quite understand what he meant.
Well, I think it gets into what do you mean by communism? If you mean by communism a state, a socialist state, for example, in which everything is controlled from the center, in which the individual counts for very little, in which things such as Wall Street might be, just closed down. You don't have to have it, and on and on and on for that. And we certainly are not anywhere close to that, thank heavens, in this country, at least in my opinion. But what I am concerned about is that bit by bit, step by step, we are marching towards a but if the millennials are still that comfortable with socialism, towards a country in which we would not have the freedom that we have today, we would not have the opportunity that we have today, that we would not have the prosperity that we have today. And so I think that may be a little bit of a shock technique by Alan to say that, but there are some danger signals out there which we must not ignore.
Thank you.
Lee, can I just say in conclusion that Just Right is in fact a very good read for everybody, and that I take pride in both having you as a colleague and also, in fact, of the publisher you picked. Charlie Copeland is here. Where are you, Charlie? Right over there. The Intercollegiate Studies Institute in Wilmington, and their book imprint is your publisher. And it's, I think, a tribute to you as the historian of the modern conservative movement that the academic/intellectual campus group of the conservative movement published your book. And so for that, we're grateful to them, but we're primarily today grateful to you for everything you've done and continue to do for promoting freedom around the world and certainly around our nation. So thank you very much for being here. And
Thank you, Ed.
we are adjourned.
Thank you.
What,
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I need to overrule the president briefly. Two notes. As a favor, we'd like to have Lee and Ann and his daughters and their husbands up here for a family photo, if they don't mind, afterwards. And Dr. Edwards usually does this spot in all of his programs. We have books for sale in the lobby, and he will be signing outside as well. Thank you all very much.